Deputy Speaker, and can I inform you that it is always one of my favourite times in a parliamentary sitting week when I get to give a speech while you are in the chair. It is something that I truly look forward to, and one that I'm going to say I am going to relish every single moment of the speech. I was going to give a 5-minute speech, but now I've realised you're in the chair, and I think I may give a much, much longer speech. And the member for Cooper, sorry, this is like double joy for me today. It's like when you put your hand in a box of chocolates and you pull out one of those cherry chocolates covered in chocolate, and it's got a bit of liqueur in there. They were always my favourite as a child. So the combination, Deputy Speaker, of you and the member for Cooper is like a cherry coated in chocolate with liqueur. So
I thank the member for McKellar. That is terrific to know. Our great pleasure would be to see you in the next parliament on the other side.
Now, Deputy Speaker, that doesn't sound very impartial from the chair, but in any case, I refuse you to goad me into lowering you down my rankings of Deputy Speakers.
Thank you.
I mean, discretion does not allow me to actually name the ranking, but I assure you, Deputy Speaker, you are very, very high on that ranking. Deputy Speaker, it is my great pleasure to speak about the Electoral Legislation Amendment Authorisation Bill 2022. The Electoral Legislation Amendment Authorisation Bill 2022 makes minor, and may I say, technical amendments to the notifying requirements for the authorisation of electoral communications. These amendments to the Electoral Act will ensure voters are presented with the current name of registered political parties and disclosure entities in authorisations for electoral communications. Currently, political parties and other disclosure entities are required to use their name as included on their most recent AEC financial return, which has the potential to mismatch from the entity's actual name where it has recently changed. The reforms ensure registered political parties authorise their communications in line with how their name, as it appears on the ballot paper, and other disclosure entities appear as they are referred to on the AEC's Transparency Register. Transparency is a very important word, and we're going to be talking a lot about transparency today, Deputy Speaker. The bill also provides some limited flexibility for registered political parties in how they present their current names in authorisation. This streamlines these requirements and avoids unnecessary duplication without distracting from clear communication with voters. For example, political parties who have the word incorporated in their registered name would be able to omit this word. Similarly, the bill enables registered political parties which are a branch of or division of a federal party to omit the words specifically referred to the branch or division. This avoids unnecessary duplication, noting authorisation specify an entity's location as part of their notifying particulars. The reforms also allow the flexibility for these parties to use their registered abbreviations for authorisations. To provide consistent alignment with the Electoral Act, these reforms also apply to the Broadcasting Acts and the Referendum Act. Deputy Speaker, I have to digress slightly here. One of my most favourite authorisations of all times was when I first joined the Liberal Party, and I think John Howard was running for re-election in 1998. And Tony Nutt, a great servant of the Liberal Party, had become the State Director in New South Wales. So all electoral advertising had to be authorised by Tony Nutt of the Liberal Party in New South Wales. Of course, Tony's actual name is Anthony Nutt. And so instead of being authorised T Nutt, Liberal Party New South Wales, it became vote for John Howard, authorised by A Nutt, Liberal Party New South Wales. Of course, maybe we should make provisions in this law that where there are synonyms like that, we can allow people not to embarrass Prime Ministers or opposition leaders seeking election to the highest office in the land. The second piece of legislation I'd like to talk to is the Electoral Legislation Amendment COVID Enfranchisement Bill 2022. The Electoral Legislation Amendment COVID Enfranchisement Bill 2022 builds upon the government's reforms last year to provide the Australian Electoral Commission the necessary legislative tools to deliver a COVID-safe election. The bill amends the Commonwealth Electoral Act 1918 to allow the option, where necessary, to provide a contingency arrangement for electors in mandatory isolation or quarantine due to COVID-19 during the final 72 hours before polling to participate in the upcoming federal election. It can allow regulations to be made to expand the Australian Electoral Commission's secure telephone voting service to persons in mandatory isolation due to COVID-19. This accessibility of this service would be limited to persons in Australia subject to a public health order that prevents their attendance at a polling place for one of the following reasons. They have tested positive for COVID-19 using a test approved by the Therapeutic Goods Administration, or are a close household contact of such an individual, or have been otherwise directed to self-isolate or quarantine under a public health order due to the risk of transmission of COVID-19. Telephone voting is currently used for blind and low vision voters and voters in the Antarctica. Current regulations implement this through a secure two-stage telephone voting system to preserve the secrecy of the ballot. Secure telephone voting for coronavirus-affected individuals can only be offered after a person is no longer eligible to apply for a postal vote. That is, from 6:01 p.m. on Wednesday, 3 days before the polling day until the close of polls. The Electoral Commissioner would be required to issue an instrument advising that he is satisfied on reasonable grounds that the extension of this service is necessary for the due conduct of the election. He would be required to notify the Prime Minister and Leader of the Opposition before doing so, and publicly inform of integrity measures that will apply to safeguard the conduct of the poll using the telephone method of participation. The regulations will have the option to specify the circumstances and the order of admission for votes cast using this method. These provisions will automatically repeal on the 31st of December 2022. The third piece of legislation that we deal with here, or we are dealing with here, is the Electoral Legislation Amendment Foreign Influences and Offences Bill 2022. The bill amends the Electoral Act and the Referendum Act to combat foreign influence in Australian elections and strengthen the integrity of Australia's electoral communication framework. Foreign electoral communication expenditure, now more than ever, it is critical that we have the appropriate laws in place to stop foreign actors from being able to infiltrate our electoral system. Our national security agencies are warning us of threats to our democracy by malicious foreign actors. Yesterday, the ASIO Director General unveiled they had disrupted a foreign interference plot in the lead-up to an election in Australia, adding that we are seeing attempts at foreign interference at all levels of government in all states and territories. This bill will prohibit foreign individuals and entities from authorising or directly funding election campaigns. This is implemented by introducing a ban on foreign campaigners from authorising election advertisements. This amendment will support the integrity of Australian electoral processes by ensuring that only those with a legitimate connection to Australia are able to authorise electoral communications. The amendments prohibiting foreign campaigners using the existing definition of foreign donor, making these amendments simple to apply. Further, the bill will prohibit foreign campaigners from incurring electoral expenditure of $1,000 or more in a financial year or fundraising for that purpose. Together, the amendments ban foreign donors from circumventing existing restrictions within the Electoral Act by seeking to influence and conduct electoral campaigns. This builds on past reforms that established prohibitions on the receipt of foreign donations. In 2018, the Morrison government introduced a ban on foreign donations to political parties in passing the Electoral Legislation Amendment, Electoral Funding and Disclosure Reform Act. Last year, the government tightened these laws to further extend the ban on candidates, MPs, senators and associated entities through the Electoral Legislation Amendment, Political Campaigners Act 2021 and the Electoral Legislation Amendment, Annual Disclosure Equality Act 2021, which is already having an impact, Deputy Speaker, as we've seen this week, when I have to say the intrepid Rob Harris of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, due to these reforms, where the Australian Electoral Commission was able to undertake an audit of certain electoral funding by certain candidates at the previous election, and he discovered that notwithstanding the fact that some of these candidates said that they were actually in favour of reducing carbon emissions, that they were taking donations from coal miners or coal investors. And indeed they were, member for Bradfield. I mean, I was as surprised. Indeed, I would go further. I would say I was shocked shocked and horrified at this revelation. But it gets even worse, member for Bradfield. It turns out, member for Cooper, you will be interested in this too.
I'd remind the member for McKellar to be relevant.
Well, I'm being incredibly relevant to disclosure, honesty and transparency in the electoral system, Deputy Speaker. I know you, Deputy Speaker. I know you are equally concerned about these things. I know you would not stand, you of all people, Deputy Speaker, and I know the member for Cooper too, would not stand for anyone in your party taking a donation from Eddie Obeid. Indeed, I know that neither those members opposite, or not that you're opposite, Deputy Speaker, but those members who are members opposite would ever imagine that they would say one thing and then do another. That would never occur to our member of the Labor Party to do. And they certainly would never, and this I know for sure, I know that if the tobacco lobby came knocking on your door, Deputy Speaker, and offering you a $100,000 cheque, that you would turn them away politely, I have no doubt. And you would also, not only would you not accept the $100,000 cheque, but if you were to accept the $100,000 cheque, which I cannot imagine a scenario under the sun where that would be the case,
well,
Deputy
that's
Speaker.
good, I'm glad.
You would then not imagine that you would then say to one of, well, I'm not suggesting that this occurred, but a scenario where you would say to your electoral returning officer, oh, this would be a bit embarrassing given my previous comments and my policy stance and the things that I believe in, that my largest donor would be someone from the tobacco industry lobby. So could you please hide this? Could you please hide this by spreading it out over 8 people so that I don't have to disclose it? Indeed, in earlier, and I know that very few people in this House would ever dream of seeking...
Order. The member for McKellar, could you please get back to the legislation before us?
Deputy Speaker,
we're not
I am
asking
speaking...
for running commentary on electoral donations.
Oh, no, Deputy Speaker, I am speaking directly to foreign donations and donations generally made in the Electoral Act. And you, Deputy Speaker, I know why you are trying to get me to limit my comments, because I know that you know how embarrassing this is for a member of this parliament. And I noticed that particular member of parliament was down to speak on this bill. I assumed it was either sarcasm or irony that they decided to do that, but they've exercised judgment that they haven't exercised to this point in accepting a $100,000 donation and then seeking to hide it. They exercise judgment by deciding not to speak on this bill. And I say to you, Deputy Speaker, just as you would not accept a $100,000 cheque from the tobacco industry, just as you would not then try to hide that by spreading it over 8 separate people so that it was under the disclosure limit, I can't understand why it is that that anyone thinks that this is okay. And of course, this went unreported by the ABC. It went unreported by The Guardian. It took the Sydney Morning Herald, a crack team of investigative journalists at the Sydney Morning Herald that has now been, and I say this in, I think, probably dark humour, that has now been described as a pro-government paper. This is something I missed when, how a paper that publishes, very very journalists like Jackie Malley, and until recently Elizabeth Farrelly, who joined the Labor Party, how these journalists could be described as pro-liberal, and they were very prominent journalists at the Sydney Morning Herald, strikes me as curious. But apparently, the problem we have here is not actually a problem, we just have a PR problem. Now, I note that Simon Holmes à Court is speaking at the National Press Club in 5 minutes. I wonder if those intrepid journalists, who I know get frightened by people who've inherited a lot of money, I wonder if some of them will stand up at the microphone and ask the tough questions. Like, if you tried to hide a $100,000 donation from a director of a coal company, how can we trust you that you haven't tried to hide other donations? And when it comes to it, we realise, of course, that the member responsible for this, the Climate 200 candidate, is using exactly the same person who is being used by Simon Holmes à Court to run his fundraising entity. Now, oh dear.
Order.
Oh
order.
dear
The
indeed.
member's time has expired.